In the damp chill of an Oregon spring night in 1969, the logging town of Silver Creek slept under a blanket of fog that rolled down from the Cascades like a living thing. Just after midnight, a lone truck rumbled down Pine Hollow Road, the same stretch where 19-year-old Annie Whitlow was last seen alive. The sound of its engine faded into the mist, leaving behind silence and the echo of a mystery that would grip this quiet community for more than half a century. Annie was known by everyone in Silver Creek. She worked part-time at a diner off Route 22, saving money for nursing school in Portland. Her smile was the kind that made strangers feel like old friends, and she had a reputation for showing up wherever someone needed help. Church potlucks, school fundraisers, local blood drives. On April 12, 1969, she closed the diner at 10 p.m., waved goodbye to her coworkers, and drove off in her faded blue Volkswagen Beetle. She never made it home. When the sun rose the next morning, Annie's car was found 5 miles outside town, neatly parked on the shoulder of Pine Hollow Road. Her purse sat on the passenger seat. The driver's door was open, and her keys still dangled in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the mud, no witnesses. It was as if she had stepped out of the car and vanished into the fog. At first, the Silver Creek Police Department believed it might be a runaway case, a theory no one in town accepted. Annie was responsible, grounded, and had been preparing for midterms the next week. Her boyfriend, Tom Merrick, told investigators she'd been in good spirits that evening. She was excited about leaving town, he recalled. She wanted to see the world, but she wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. The initial investigation lasted months. Detectives drained nearby ponds, canvassed the forest, and interviewed everyone within a 10-mile radius. They found nothing. By summer, Annie's disappearance became another small-town legend, whispered in diners and gas stations, the girl who vanished into the fog. But for her family, time stood still. Her mother, Helen Whitlow, kept Annie's room untouched, the bed neatly made, a small stack of nursing brochures still sitting on the desk. Every year, on April 12th, she lit a candle in the window facing Pine Hollow Road, waiting for her daughter to come home. In 1972, 3 years after the disappearance, hunters found a set of skeletal remains near the old Holloway logging trail, 8 miles from where Annie's car had been abandoned. Coroner determined they belonged to a young woman, and dental records confirmed the worst. It was Annie. Her body had been buried shallowly under pine needles and clay. No clothing remained, except for a torn blouse button and a silver ring engraved with the initials AW. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide, cause undetermined, but likely strangulation based on the neck fractures. Without any physical evidence or witnesses, the case went cold again. Over the years, detectives came and went. The case file, labeled Whitlow 69, grew dusty in the basement of the Marion County Sheriff's Office. The few leads that did surface all ended the same way: dead ends. A truck driver passing through the area that night, a drifter picked up in Salem, a local logger with a history of violence, all questioned, none charged. By the mid-1980s, the Whitlow case had faded from headlines, but not from the heart of one young patrol officer named Dean Collins. He'd grown up in Silver Creek, just 2 streets away from the Whitlow family. As a child, he'd seen the missing posters plastered on grocery store walls. Now, as a deputy, he couldn't shake the thought of that unsolved case haunting his hometown. In 1986, Collins petitioned to reopen the investigation. Using the limited forensic resources available, he re-examined the evidence, mostly photographs, handwritten notes, and the recovered ring. There were no biological samples to test, no preserved tissue or trace material. But there was one small envelope, labeled Miscellaneous Debris, Holloway Trail, containing a few strands of what looked like hair stuck to a fragment of decayed fabric. Collins sent it to the State Crime Lab in Portland. The response came weeks later: insufficient material for analysis. Still, Collins persisted. He interviewed anyone still alive who remembered that night. Among them was Arthur Lee, the retired police chief who had led the original investigation. Lee mentioned something that had never made it into the official reports: a red pickup truck seen parked near Annie's car that night. The driver had never been identified. That detail reignited Collins's obsession. He tracked down registration records from the late 1960s, finding 132 red pickup trucks registered in Marion County at that time. After months of cross-referencing, he narrowed it down to 14 that matched the make and model witnesses had vaguely described: a 1965 Ford F-100. One name caught his eye: Edward "Eddie" Vaughn, a mechanic who'd worked at a nearby sawmill until 1970 before moving to California. Vaughn had a minor criminal record: assault, trespassing, public intoxication. Nothing that screamed killer. Still, Collins contacted California authorities. Vaughn was living in Bakersfield under his own name, retired, married, no apparent trouble. With no forensic evidence linking him to the crime, the trail went cold again. For the next 3 decades, the Whitlow case sat dormant, revisited only in local newspaper retrospectives titled Oregon's Forgotten Mysteries. Helen Whitlow passed away in 2003, never knowing what happened to her daughter. Dean Collins retired in 2012, still carrying a photo of Annie in his wallet. She deserved more than what we gave her, he told a local reporter during his retirement interview. Then, in 2019, the Oregon State Police launched a statewide cold case initiative to reprocess evidence using advanced DNA technology. One of the first cases on their list was Whitlow, 69, a young forensic scientist named Dr. Madison Crane, recently transferred from Quantico, was assigned to catalog and rescan all physical evidence from Marion County's cold case archive. When Crane opened the decades-old Whitlow evidence box, the first thing she noticed was the deteriorating paper envelope labeled Miscellaneous Debris, Holloway Trail. Inside were those same strands of hair that Dean Collins had sent for testing 33 years earlier. But now, DNA sequencing had evolved beyond anything possible in 1986. Using touch DNA analysis, Crane extracted a partial profile, female, consistent with Annie Whitlow's known samples. But there was more. Mixed within those strands was a secondary male DNA profile, faint but readable. Crane ran the sample through CODIS, the national DNA database. No match. But when she uploaded the profile to GEDmatch, a genealogical platform used for forensic genealogy, the system returned a partial match to a family tree in California, a Vaughn family from Kern County. Detectives traced the lineage back and found the name Edward Vaughn, deceased since 2005. But Vaughn's son, Richard Vaughn, a 58-year-old truck driver, still lived in Oregon. Detectives obtained a discarded coffee cup from Richard to compare against the old sample. The DNA was a 99.98% paternal match. The revelation was staggering. The man Dean Collins had once suspected, Edward Vaughn, had been the killer all along. The genetic link proved that the DNA at the crime scene came from him. After 50 years, Annie Whitlow's case finally had its name. The next challenge was reconstructing the why. Old employment records showed Vaughn had worked at the same sawmill as Annie's father, often stopping by the diner where she worked. Witnesses from that era remembered him as too friendly, a man who lingered just a little too long in conversations, who smiled too easily at young women. One former coworker told detectives he'd make comments about that waitress, Annie, I think her name was, said she was too good for this town. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Vaughn's widow, Margaret, still alive at 82. When detectives visited her in 2020, she agreed to talk. Sitting in her small cottage surrounded by photos of a life long gone, she confessed that on the night of Annie's disappearance, Edward had come home late, clothes muddy, hands shaking. He told her his truck had gotten stuck near Pine Hollow Road. She hadn't thought about it again for 50 years. "I didn't want to believe he could hurt someone," she said quietly, "but part of me always knew something wasn't right about that night." The statement, though heartbreaking, sealed the narrative. The DNA had named him. The timeline confirmed it, and the confession gave it humanity. 50 years after Annie's disappearance, the Oregon State Police closed the Whitlow case. But what no one expected was that the DNA test, that faint male profile, would reveal more than just one killer. When the lab reran the results to confirm accuracy, they discovered additional genetic markers pointing to another unsolved murder from 1970, one that had haunted the nearby town of Miller's Crossing for decades. The same DNA, the same signature, the same man. And with that discovery, what had started as one family's tragedy was about to expose a pattern that spanned across Oregon, a pattern that had remained buried beneath the fog of Pine Hollow Road for half a century. The revelation that Edward Vaughn's DNA connected not only to Annie Whitlow's murder, but also to another unsolved homicide sent shockwaves through the Oregon State Police. Inside the Portland Cold Case Unit, fluorescent lights hummed over stacks of reopened files, while detectives stared at printouts linking crimes decades apart. It wasn't just a match. It was the first sign of a serial predator who had operated undetected along Oregon's logging corridor for years. The second case came from the archives of Miller's Crossing, a farming town 70 miles south of Silver Creek. In May 1970, a 24-year-old schoolteacher named Karen Bloom was found partially buried near a riverside picnic area. Her car had been discovered 2 miles away, keys in the ignition, similar to Annie's disappearance. The file listed unknown assailant, and the physical evidence, a section of blouse and a cigarette filter, had been boxed, sealed, and forgotten. Dr. Madison Crane requested those samples immediately. Within days, she confirmed the impossible. The same partial male profile that had been extracted from the fibers near Annie Whitlow's remains appeared again in the Bloom evidence. Statistically, the odds of coincidence were less than 1 in 10 billion. Detective Collins, now retired but still consulting, received the call he'd waited his entire career to hear. "Dean," Crane told him, "you were right about Vaughn, and it's bigger than anyone imagined." Collins sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of vindication mixed with sorrow. "How many more?" he finally asked. That question lit a fire inside the task force. Using newly digitized archives, investigators cross-referenced violent crimes between 1968 and 1973 within a 100-mile radius of Silver Creek. They uncovered 5 unsolved homicides of young women, each abducted or found near forest roads, each case marked by minimal evidence, and all predating Vaughn's move to California in 1970. Patterns began to emerge: isolated highways, weekend disappearances, and the telltale presence of tire treads consistent with an F-100 pickup. The similarities were chilling. Vaughn had exploited Oregon's geography, dense pine forests, remote logging trails, and an era before DNA databases or surveillance cameras, to hunt with near-total invisibility. Detective Sarah Lang, the youngest member of the task force, spearheaded what they called Project Fogline, a systematic re-examination of every unsolved case in the region that shared Vaughn's signature. Her office wall filled with photographs, maps, and connecting counties like arteries of forgotten tragedy. Each pin represented a life that had vanished into the mist, perhaps claimed by the same man. Lang's approach combined new-school analytics with old-school intuition. She requested soil comparisons, fiber matches, and, where possible, trace DNA retesting. Piece by piece, the mosaic sharpened. Vaughn's employment records placed him near Miller's Crossing, Oak Grove, and Pine Haven at the time of 3 separate disappearances. Payroll logs showed unexplained absences aligning with each victim's date of death. But what stunned investigators most was how ordinary Vaughn's life had appeared afterward. After leaving Oregon in 1970, he'd settled quietly in Bakersfield, opened a small repair shop, raised 2 sons, and died of heart failure at 65. There were no further violent incidents, no arrests, no whispers. It was as if the darkness in him had gone dormant once he escaped Oregon. Dr. Crane struggled to reconcile the scientific detachment of her work with the human stories behind the data. Every sequence of letters in that genome corresponds to a victim who never came home, she told Lang late one night. The science doesn't just identify a killer, it resurrects the voices he tried to silence. Media outlets caught wind of the breakthrough after an internal memo leaked. Headlines blared. DNA links Oregon mechanic to decades-old murders. For families who had spent lifetimes in limbo, hope and heartbreak collided. Reporters swarmed Silver Creek, filming the same fog-shrouded roads where Annie's car had been found half a century earlier. The attention brought new information. Tip lines lit up with calls from retired loggers, former deputies, even drifters who'd passed through Oregon in the late 60s. One call stood out. A man, named Cliff Hartman, now 78, claimed he'd worked with Vaughn at the Holloway Mill in 1969. Hartman recalled something odd. Vaughn frequently volunteered for night shifts that ended near dawn, and once he showed up late, covered in mud, saying he'd gotten his truck stuck near that Whitlow girl's road. Hartman's memory, though aged, gave the timeline weight. Investigators compared it against weather logs. Heavy rain that night, muddy shoulders, and confirmed it fit perfectly. Vaughn had likely abducted Annie on her drive home, taken her to an isolated trail, and concealed her body before sunrise. Detectives presented their findings at a closed-door press briefing in Salem. The PowerPoint slide showing Vaughn's photograph beside Annie Whitlow's and Karen Bloom's hit the room like a punch. After 50 years, Oregon had its answer: Edward Vaughn, the fog line killer. But closure brought another dilemma. With Vaughn long dead, prosecutors could never bring charges. Families wanted something tangible, a conviction, a sentence, a sense that justice had a heartbeat. The Attorney General proposed an unprecedented move: a posthumous indictment, a symbolic trial in absentia to establish the official record of guilt. It wouldn't imprison anyone, but it would formally exonerate the victims from suspicion and document the truth for history. The hearing took place in a modest courtroom in Portland in April 2021, almost 52 years to the day after Annie vanished. A handful of surviving relatives attended, clutching photographs worn from decades of hope. On the prosecution table lay the evidence: the ring, the photographs, the DNA charts, each piece illuminated by courtroom lights like relics of a buried past. Dr. Crane testified first, explaining how trace DNA had survived decades sealed inside a paper envelope. She described the precision of modern sequencing, the paternal match to Vaughn's bloodline, and the near impossibility of error. Then, Detective Lang took the stand, reading excerpts from witness statements, payroll logs, and travel routes that placed Vaughn at every scene. When the presiding judge finally declared Vaughn guilty in absentia, silence filled the courtroom. There were no cheers, no applause, just quiet tears and the soft click of reporters' cameras. After the verdict, Dean Collins stood outside beneath a drizzle that smelled of pine and wet asphalt. "It's strange," he told a journalist. "You chase a ghost for 50 years, then when you finally catch him, there's no one left to punish. But maybe justice isn't always about punishment. Maybe it's about truth finally standing in the open." Forensic units continued to analyze Vaughn's DNA, cross-checking it with other cold cases. Across the Pacific Northwest, by late 2021, They confirmed connections to 2 additional disappearances previously attributed to accidents. The total count stood at 7. Each match rewrote another file, changed another death certificate from unknown to homicide, and returned another name from the abyss. News coverage shifted from sensational headlines to reflective documentaries about forensic persistence. Viewers across the country were captivated by how a single degraded strand of hair could unravel decades of silence. True crime forums dubbed Dr. Crane the scientist who solved the fog line. But inside her modest lab, she avoided the spotlight. "The story isn't about me," she told colleagues. "It's about the people who never gave up, the officers who saved evidence before they even knew why it mattered." The town of Silver Creek erected a small memorial at the bend of Pine Hollow Road. A brass plaque bore 7 engraved names under the heading "Justice Through Persistence." Locals left flowers there, sometimes candles, sometimes old diner receipts tucked under stones, quiet tributes to the lives once taken by the fog. By year's end, the case of Edward Vaughn was officially closed. Yet for those who had lived through the fear of that era, closure was complicated. Some wondered if others had known, if whispers in the sawmill break room or odd behaviors had gone unreported. "We thought monsters lived in cities," an elderly resident said at the memorial dedication. "We didn't know one lived next door." In 2022, filmmakers approached the Oregon State Police about producing a documentary series on the fog line killer. Detectives agreed, on the condition that proceeds fund a scholarship for forensic science students. During filming, Dr. F. Field Crane shared one final revelation. Among the samples in the evidence box, she'd found a partial fingerprint on the inside of the envelope, not Vaughn's, but Dean Collins's, dated 1986. "It means," she said, "that if he hadn't reopened the file all those years ago, those hairs would have been lost. He preserved the path to justice without even knowing it." The documentary closed with archival footage of Pine Hollow Road, the same mist creeping through the trees, the camera panning toward dawn. Over narration, Collins's recorded voice spoke softly. "Sometimes justice moves slower than the fog, but sooner or later, the sun finds its way through."